The structure of task 4 is actually very similar to the structure of task 3 because they're both integrated tasks with reading, listening, and then your response, which is spoken. Now, the difference, of course, is that you're reading from a textbook and listening to a lecture in the 4th task, and then you speak about the lecture. But you begin in a very similar way to task 3. You begin by summarizing what you read in the text. Now, that text is a definition. So you're going to define that same idea. You're going to give a general definition of the concept. That should only take 1 or 2 sentences, and it is quick. About 10 seconds, maybe 15 seconds. Try not to spend too much time on this because you will give more concrete details from the lecture after, and those concrete details can take more time. So, for example, in the reading, we get a general definition of syllable timing and stress timing, which are ways to describe how a language sounds when it's spoken. In other words, they're categories we can put languages in based on their rhythms. Okay, so now I have just given a general definition, a very broad idea about these two things, syllable timing and stress timing. They are categories. They are ways of describing a language. Now, the next part I'm going to do is about what the professor said. And this will give explanations and examples and details which which explain better what was in my first part, what was in my general definition. So this is a good chance to link the text and the lecture. At the beginning you talk about the text, and now you talk about the lecture, and you can make that connection by talking about the professor and naming the professor as the source. So for example, you say, the professor illustrates with the example of, or the professor goes further than the text by giving the example of, or anything like that. The professor explains these concepts by. If you are naming the professor or the lecture, you could say, in the lecture we heard an example of. Then you are now moving on to the listening, which is really what the question is about. It asks you to explain the concept with examples from the lecture. That's the main, the most important part of your answer. So here's an example taking from a lecture, the more specific details that define syllable and stress timing. The professor illustrates the difference with the examples of Jamaican English and standard North American English. He says that Jamaican English speakers, for instance, don't stress individual syllables very much. Instead, they stress each syllable the same. All right, here I have an introduction with the professor illustrates the difference. Now I'm moving on to talk about the lecture in my second part, and I use specific details from the lecture to define how this Jamaican English relates to the idea of syllable timing and stress timing. Next, I'm going to do the same thing again with the second example from the lecture. And in order to introduce that, I can use a contrast word or a comparison word or a list word that shows the relationship between the two examples. Because example 1 and example 2 might be very similar, or they might be contrasting, or maybe they are just more of the same. So a phrase like meanwhile, what's more, similarly, on the other hand, secondly, next. You're just moving on to the next idea, moving on to the next example. This has the same importance and timing as part 2. So as I said, about 10 seconds for the definition at the beginning, and then after that you have a full 50 seconds more to give parts 2 and 3, so that would be about 25 seconds in each of these. You could spend 20 and 20 here if you are very quick, and then give a little summary at the end. A summary should not take any more than 5 to 10 seconds, or you can skip the summary altogether and take a full 25 seconds on both. So this part 3, the example is going to look very similar to the example from part 2. North American English speakers, on the other hand, they do the opposite, according to the professor. I mean, they stress some syllables extra. So basically, that makes the language stress-timed, because the speed of a sentence changes based on how many stresses there are. Okay, and this, like I said, is very similar to part 2. I'm giving a little introduction here with this transition phrase that shows contrast in this example, and then I'm talking about the specific details from the lecture and how they relate to stress timing and syllable timing in the text. So to recap, start by summarizing the concept from the text, giving that definition. Next, explain the first concrete detail from the lecture, and then explain the second concrete detail. And in both cases, you're going to transition. So you transition into the lecture by talking about what the professor does in relation to the text. So the professor illustrates this, the professor gives examples, and then you transition by using that list or contrast, like next or on the other hand, to move to the second detail.